what you already know, the cost of disasters is going up exponentially decade after decade. And this is for a variety of reasons, but by and large, it's because of increased exposures, right? So the value and the concentration of assets is increasing over time. Couple that with climate change, rising seas, and a variety of other factors, the cost is going up. You already know that. What you might not know is that the proportion of the total cost that is insured versus uninsured is going up exponentially, and that's where we should be concerned, right? So the gap between the grayish color there and the blue. So let's look at 2011 real quick. In 2011, if you added up the total cost of all natural and man-made disasters globally, you had $403 billion worth of economic loss. Of that $403 billion of economic loss, only $126 billion was insured. So that begs the question, who's paying for the other $277 billion? And the answer is, you are, right? If we look and we dig a little bit more granularly at where that uninsured loss goes, it overwhelmingly is absorbed by the public sector, right? Governments, and thereby the taxpayer. Because we look at, if you break down the cost of these disasters, it's not just about destroyed buildings and homes and other things that you would traditionally insure, but it's also all the extraneous costs like debris removal, the impact to budgets for lost tax revenue, economic production losses, right? Think about New York City being shut down for a couple of weeks and the economic toll that might have. So there's a tremendous amount of costs that are just shouldered by the government that are not insured in the private market. And what do governments do currently? I'll go back real quick. What do governments do currently to fund those disasters? They do three things. They raise taxes, they raid budgets, take money away from other important priorities. Instead of building that beautiful state-of-the-art hospital, they're instead focusing their attention on rebuilding a bridge. Or they go to the capital markets and they issue debt post-event, mortgaging the future. And these are, in our view, three really efficient ways of paying for things that we know are going to happen. So perhaps there's something that we could be doing collectively in advance to reduce that exposure. And I put this next slide on here because, and this is again probably something you already know, but the ratio of the total cost of disasters that is being absorbed by the federal government is astounding. In 2008, 77%. And I point this out because I want states and cities and communities to be thinking about their role in funding future losses. Because at some point, the federal government's going to start saying, sorry, not going to do it anymore, right? And so you have to own your risk, right? You have to take a little bit more proactive role in financing this exposure, because FEMA and HUD and all these other entities at the federal level are not going to be there. And we talk about climate change, right? That's driving a lot of costs. But what's really driving costs is the growth and exposure. This is an interesting picture because this is Shanghai in 1990. This is Shanghai 20 years later. Just 20 years. If you look at the US, more than 50% of the US population lives within 50 miles of the coastline. We're putting all of our money in the most disaster-prone areas. We like to live by water. This is what's driving the cost. And so if you look at the US, right, we've got $11 trillion worth of assets from the border of Mexico up to the border of Canada. 11 trillion, 25% of that's in New York State alone. Another 25% in Florida. We know that sea level rise is increasing. We know that the cost of disasters on an annualized basis is $60 to $100 billion every year. Sandy was about $70 billion. I want to point out this last bullet. I saw there's a lot of words on this slide. But in 2012, the US government, the federal government, spent $96 billion on climate-related losses. If this was a budget line item, we call this the climate disruption budget, and we put that as a line item, it would be the largest non-defense discretionary budget line item in the entire budget. We spent more on climate-related losses than we spent on transportation or education in total. So, like I said before, Let's stop paying for these things that we know are going to happen after the fact. Let's stop raising taxes, and poorer countries or developing countries are going around the world hat in hand asking for donations. Let's stop shouldering the taxpayers with additional tax bills, even after the fact they have to rebuild their homes as well. Let's figure out ways to pre-finance these disasters. And that's really what we're trying to do here. We're trying to close this financial gap. Now, I'll come back to that topic in just a second, but I want to point out one thing because I think it's relevant to this crowd and particularly this region. So Swiss Re, as a reinsurer, right, we have to be thinking 50 to 100 years down the road. We have to be thinking about not the next hurricane, but what does a hurricane look like in 2100? We've had a chief climate change officer at Swiss Re since the 1980s. This is how seriously we take this topic, right? Because the more severe storms are, the more exposure we have on our balance sheet, and our shareholders don't like that. So we need to make sure that we have a really good grasp of the exposure. So what we did is we developed a methodology using our proprietary models to help quantify the exposure of governments and communities to climate change. Put a dollar figure on that exposure, and then we empower decision makers with the methodology to determine what actions they can take and what's the cost-benefit analysis, right? Is it worth it to build a $40 billion seawall around New York City? Will we see the return on the investment? And so this is the kind of thing that we wanted to look at. So we did just this. And that's sort of what I just talked about. You saw this chart yesterday. Josh showed this. This is what we call a loss frequency curve. That's insurance nerd talk. But this is looking specifically at New York City, right? So the city of New York hired us and a couple of partners to do this kind of analysis. And as Josh pointed out yesterday, Sandy was a $19 billion event in New York, but if you put it through several climate change scenarios using our models, we figure out that by the year 2050, it becomes a $90 billion event. So Sandy was a 1 in 70 year event, turns into a $90 billion event by the year 2050. Also, the frequency increases. So what is a $90 billion event today, a $19 billion event today, is a 1 in 70 year event. That quickly becomes a 1 in 50 year event. So the frequency of these losses is now increasing. And so we look today, we figured out that New York City loses $1.7 billion every single year, annualized, to climate change, to climate events. $1.7 billion every single year. Now, some years, obviously, they're not going to have any. And some years, they're going to have a Sandy. So we're spreading this out on an annualized basis. And then, of course, you add the impact of climate change. And then you add the impact of the increasing frequency of events. And we predicted by the year 2050, if New York City does nothing, they'll lose $4.4 billion every single year as a result of climate change. Okay, so now we put a number to it. I think that's a powerful motivator, right? So then, and this is sort of a generic slide, but what we're then able to do is figure out exactly what adaptation measures can be implemented, what is the cost over the annualized cost over the life of that adaptation measure, whether that be a seawall or green infrastructure or sandbags, and then figure out if the loss that it would reduce is worth the cost of implementing that measure, right? So anything below that lower dotted line is absolutely worth the investment. Anything above that upper one, not worth the expenditure. And so now you have the tools necessary to drive decisions. So let's talk a little bit about what governments are doing, right? So now that they're seeing the cost of these disasters go up and the pressure it's putting on their balance sheets, how are governments implementing some solutions, right? So it's important to build seawalls and harden our buildings and change building codes and change land use policy, but it's also important to think about how we're going to implement financial mechanisms to absorb some of that shock. So let's take Alabama for a second. So Alabama, as we all know, is exposed to catastrophic hurricane. And they have about $50 billion worth of state assets spread across the entire state. They already buy traditional insurance through the traditional insurance markets, but what they realize is that their exposure goes far beyond the cost, again, of just the buildings themselves. It's what's it going to take what's it going to cost to evacuate people? What's it going to cost to bring supplies in post-event? What's the impact to our tax base if the hotels in the region are taken out for a 6-month period, right? So what they decided to do is something that we call parametric insurance. I'm going to get a little nerdy on you for a second. But so traditional insurance, as we all know it, is what we call indemnity insurance. It's based upon the loss, right? You buy a car insurance policy, you do $2,000 worth of damage to your car, you bicker back and forth with your insurance company, and then they issue you a check for maybe $2,000, and then you have to use that money to fix the car. Parametric insurance works differently. Parametric insurance is based upon the characteristics of the event. In the case of Alabama, the characteristic we were looking for was wind speed. We know that the stronger the wind speed, the more substantial the damage. So what we did is we drew a box over the coastline of Alabama. And if a Category 3 hurricane storm crosses through that box, it releases a payment to the state. And it's very quickly. So there's 3 key benefits to parametrics. One is the speed of payment. Because there's no lengthy claims adjustment process and figuring out what is the value of the loss, we can pay out sometimes as little as 10 days. And this is critically important for governments especially. A company like National Grid or Walmart, they have cash on hand. They have liquidity. They can pay for all kinds of unexpected events. Governments have no liquidity. There's no cash laying around just in case, well, maybe one day we'll get hit by a hurricane. And if they do have that kind of a fund, maybe it gets raided for other purposes. That's never happened before, but hypothetically, no. So speed of payment is really important. Also, because it's not tied directly to the loss, you have flexibility in the use of the proceeds. The government gets to choose how they allocate that resource. Are they going to use it to bring in fuel? Are they going to use it to get people out? Are they going to use it to offset lost tax revenue? That's their decision to make. And the third is it's incredibly transparent, right? The wind either blew at 111 miles an hour or it didn't. And it's determined by the National Hurricane Center, not by us, not by you. So this is what Alabama did. Let's get a little more interesting here real quick. Okay, so this is a transaction that was just completed in the most unlikely of places in Uruguay. It's the largest energy risk transfer solution ever done. We did it in partnership with the World Bank. But Uruguay produces, the vast majority of its energy production is from hydro. Well, now we're starting to see the impacts of climate change, and there's a lot of volatility in the amount of average annual rainfall. When they have a reduction in the amount of average annual rainfall, the production power goes down. Then they have to go to the open market and buy oil from Argentina or Brazil. But guess what? They don't get to choose the price at which they're buying it, right? They have to buy it in the open global market just like everybody else does. So what we were able to do is help them absorb the shock of that price tag. So the structure we designed said, if average annual rainfall falls by X and global oil prices are Y, here's your money to pay for the oil, effectively, right? So this helps, again, protect their fiscal situation against unpredictable shocks. I'm going to skip that one. This one's by far my favorite because this one's actually paid out a number of times. So we all know that the Caribbean gets ransacked year after year from hurricanes and earthquakes and all kinds of other natural disasters, and they're constantly trying to sort of dig themselves out of this vicious cycle of poverty. These are all related to the natural disasters that they face. So 16 countries pulled their resources together, and they all bought individual parametric insurance policies. And this was established back in 2006, 2007. It's paid out about 8 or 9 times since it was started. And Swiss Re is the largest reinsurer on this program, but it was placed through the World Bank again. So every island that's participating buys a hurricane policy and buys an earthquake policy. So in January of 2010 was the Haiti earthquake. The Haiti earthquake killed 200,000 people in a couple of minutes. The parametric earthquake policy that they purchased, which again was a box drawn over the island of Hispaniola, and the trigger was, let's say, magnitude 7.0, and the earthquake was, I think, a 7.1 or 7.2. That triggered. It was one of the largest and fastest cash infusions to the Haitian central bank in the days following the event. They got the cash within 10 days. So while you've got countries sending hundreds of millions of dollars worth of blankets and bottles of water and tents, that's great, and food, here's cash on hand. And so the deputy finance minister of Haiti called my colleague in New York and said, because of how fast you were able to get us the cash, we were able to pay the police to continue working on the streets in the days following the event. And we like to think that that had an impact on looting and sort of civil justice or civil unrest and things like that. So this is active, it's growing. We're now looking to expand it into Central America. This has been replicated in the Pacific Islands. A typhoon just came through and hit the island of Tonga. I didn't know anything lived there, but apparently people live there. And anyway, they got hit and they got a payment within, I think, about 10 days. Let's see if there's anything else interesting in here. This is one last thing I'll touch on, because I want you to think about sort of all the potential angles here, right? So if you look at the world in a pyramid, right, so the insurance industry does a decent job of covering the middle of the pyramid, right? So advanced economies, major corporations, but where the gap is, where that uninsured loss is the top of the pyramid, what I'll call macro insurance for governments, but also the bottom of the pyramid. Right, think about this, there's 4 billion people around the globe that earn less than $4 a day. So when those people are affected by natural disasters, inevitably they're going to fall in the back of the government anyway. So if we can attack the pyramid from both ends, this is what we did in Haiti. So you've got microfinance institutions that go out there and issue these loans to micro-entrepreneurs. And the micro-entrepreneurs borrow money at exceedingly high interest rates because they're a big credit risk. So let's say a female micro-entrepreneur in Haiti takes out a $200 loan to open a food stand in Port-au-Prince. And then a hurricane comes through, knocks out her business, destroys her home. She defaults on the loan because she can't pay it back. And the microfinance institution that lent the money is also suffering, so they have to write down the loan, so their ability to lend is impaired. So this is a horrible situation. So what we were able to do is, again, using parametric insurance. Again, remember, we're protecting the government at the top. Now we're protecting the bottom of the pyramid. So what we did is we attached a parametric insurance policy to the loan. So when the event occurs, the hurricane hits, the earthquake shakes, or there's excess rainfall, let's say inundation of massive rain, it triggers the policy. It not only pays the micro-entrepreneur to rebuild their house, it pays off the balance of the existing loan, and it recapitalizes a new loan so that they can immediately get back on their feet. So now we're trying to build this sustainability, and hopefully that those people that were borrowing money are now able to not fall on the back of the government. They've got enough problems to worry about. So anyway, thank you very much.